Sarah Johnson woke up a little earlier than usual. The digital clock showed 5:45 a.m. She took a deep breath and slowly got out of bed. Her husband Mark was still fast asleep beside her. "Today is Emily's open house," Sarah whispered to herself. On her way to the kitchen, she stopped in front of her 10-year-old daughter Emily's room. She gently opened the door, checked on her sleeping daughter, and smiled with relief. While preparing breakfast, Sarah was organizing today's schedule in her head. Morning shift at the hospital as usual. Emily's school open house in the afternoon. And then the night shift. "Looks like it's going to be a busy day," she said to herself while brewing coffee. At 7 o'clock, the whole family was up and gathered in the kitchen. "Good morning, Mom," Emily said, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Good morning, sweetie," Sarah replied, gently patting her daughter's head. "I'm looking forward to the open house today." Mark sat down at the table, picking up the newspaper. "Is there something special going on today?" Sarah looked at her husband with a slightly surprised face. "Yes, it's Emily's open house. It's been on the calendar since last week." "Oh, that's right. Sorry, I've been preoccupied with work," Mark replied, looking a bit apologetic. After breakfast and seeing Emily off to school, Sarah headed to the hospital. Her day as a nurse always passes by in a blur. Patient care, assisting doctors, updating records. Still, she didn't forget about Emily's open house. At 3 p.m., Sarah left the hospital and headed to Emily's school. After parking her car, she entered the school building and was enveloped by a nostalgic atmosphere. Children's artwork adorned the hallway walls. Arriving at the 5th grade classroom, she saw that some parents were already seated. Sarah took a seat at the back and waited for the class to begin. When Mrs. Anderson entered the classroom, the children greeted her in unison, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Anderson." As the class progressed, Sarah observed Emily. Her daughter was listening attentively to the teacher and occasionally raising her hand to ask questions. "She's doing well," Sarah thought to herself. However, looking closer, Sarah felt there was something off about Emily's expression. It seemed to lack its usual brightness. Sarah furrowed her brow but dismissed it as her imagination. After the class ended and parents were leaving the room, Mrs. Anderson approached Sarah. "Mrs. Johnson, do you have a moment?" Sarah was a bit surprised but answered with a smile, "Yes, of course." Mrs. Anderson looked around, making sure no one else was around, then turned to Sarah with a serious expression. "Actually, there's something I'd like to discuss about Emily." Sarah's heart started beating faster. Was there a problem? "Can we talk in the staff room?" Mrs. Anderson continued. "Yes, that's fine," Sarah answered, feeling a bit nervous. As they headed to the staff room, Sarah's mind was racing with various thoughts. Was it about Emily's grades? Or maybe issues with friends? Mrs. Anderson opened the door to the staff room and directed Sarah to a sofa. "Please, have a seat," Mrs. Anderson said. Her expression conveyed the gravity of what she was about to say. As Sarah sat down on the sofa, Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath and began to speak. "Mrs. Johnson, what I'm about to tell you is very important, and probably shocking." Sarah held her breath. What could have happened? Mrs. Anderson looked straight into Sarah's eyes and said in a heavy tone, "You need to divorce your husband immediately and go to the police." Sarah couldn't believe her ears. The shocking words, "You need to divorce your husband immediately and go to the police," echoed in her head. What? What do you mean?" Sarah asked with a confused expression. She could feel her heart pounding and her palms getting sweaty. Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath and began to explain carefully, choosing her words. "Mrs. Johnson, Emily has been acting strange for the past few weeks. She's usually a bright and active child, but recently she's been lost in thought more often." Sarah gasped. Indeed, she had felt that Emily's behavior at home was a bit off. But she never imagined it could lead to divorce or involving the police. Mrs. Anderson continued, "Last week during art class, I was concerned about a picture Emily drew." Saying this, she pulled out a drawing from her drawer. Sarah looked at the picture and gasped. It showed a small girl hiding with a frightened expression inside a dark-colored house. And a large shadow was looming over the girl. "This picture. Emily drew this." Sarah's voice trembled. Mrs. Anderson nodded quietly. "Yes. And yesterday, Emily confided in me about what she saw your husband doing in the middle of the night." Sarah's mind went blank. What could Mark have done? Did he do something to Emily? Or, "Mrs. Anderson, can you tell me specifically what happened?" Sarah asked with a shaky voice. Mrs. Anderson began to speak, carefully choosing her words. "According to Emily, last Thursday night, she went downstairs to get some water because she was thirsty. That's when she saw Mark talking to an unknown man in the living room." Sarah gasped. A stranger in the middle of the night. The man was handing a bag of some sort to Mark. Emily couldn't understand what it was, but she said Mark looked very happy when he saw it. Mrs. Anderson continued. Various possibilities raced through Sarah's mind. Was it just a late-night transaction with a friend? Or something more serious? And when Emily tried to go back upstairs, Mark noticed her. Mrs. Anderson's voice lowered. She said Mark grabbed her tightly and threatened her never to tell anyone. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. To think her daughter had such a terrifying experience. And she hadn't noticed anything. "Mrs. Johnson, as a professional, I've determined this isn't just a family matter. Emily's safety might be at risk. That's why I recommended going to the police." Mrs. Anderson looked at Sarah with a serious gaze. Sarah held her head in her hands. The happy family life she thought she had seemed to crumble in an instant. But she knew Emily's safety was the top priority. "Mrs. Anderson, thank you so much for telling me about Emily," Sarah said with a trembling voice. I don't know what to do. But I have to protect Emily." Mrs. Anderson gently held Sarah's hand. "You're a strong mother. Be brave, for Emily's sake." Sarah took a deep breath. She was confused and scared, but at the same time, a determination was growing. She had to uncover the truth to protect her daughter. "Mrs. Anderson, thank you for your advice. I need to think about this. And I'll do my best for Emily's sake." Sarah stood up and, though stumbling, left the staff room with firm steps. Her mind was in chaos, but one thing was clear. She had to reveal the truth to protect Emily. As she walked down the hallway, Sarah took deep breaths repeatedly. What should she do now? Should she confront Mark directly? Or should she really go to the police? Sarah left the school and headed to the parking lot. Getting into her car, she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But soon, she lifted her face and wiped her eyes. "I have to be strong for Emily." Sarah started the car. The road ahead might be rough, but she was determined to overcome any difficulty to protect her daughter. With this vow in her heart, Sarah drove off. As Sarah drove, various thoughts swirled in her head. Mrs. Anderson's words, Emily's drawing, and the incident in the middle of the night. Everything was in chaos. When she got home, Emily was already there. "Mom, welcome home," she called out cheerfully, but Sarah thought she could see anxiety hidden behind her daughter's smile. "Emily, how was your day?" Sarah asked, trying to act normal. "It was okay," Emily answered somewhat vaguely. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly. "Emily, you know, Mommy loves you very much. No matter what happens, I'm always on your side." Emily looked a bit surprised but quickly clung to her mother. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stared at Mark sleeping next to her, pondering his true nature. The next morning, Sarah made up her mind. She would consult a professional first. Sarah made an appointment with the school counselor, Miss Thompson, and nervously knocked on her office door. "Come in," a voice prompted, and as she entered the room, Miss Thompson greeted her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Johnson, please have a seat. What brings you here today?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to talk about what Mrs. Anderson had told her yesterday, the changes in Emily's behavior, and her own concerns. Miss Thompson listened to Sarah's story with a serious expression. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand your concerns. In situations like this, it's important to act carefully. But what should I do? Should I go to the police? Or?" Sarah's voice trembled. Miss Thompson smiled gently. "First, ensuring Emily's safety is the top priority. And it's also important to gather evidence. But don't forget about your own safety, okay?" Sarah nodded. Miss Thompson continued, "My advice is to first deepen your trust relationship with Emily. Create an environment where she feels safe to talk. And carefully observe Mark's behavior. But it's crucial not to put yourself in danger." "I understand." "Thank you," Sarah replied, looking a bit relieved. Miss Thompson gave Sarah the contact information for an emergency hotline for parents. "Please call anytime if anything happens." "You're not alone." As Sarah left the office, she held a new determination in her heart. She had to act carefully to protect Emily and uncover the truth. From that day on, Sarah began to observe Mark's behavior with utmost care. She noticed unusual things like him getting up more frequently at night and suddenly going out more often. At the same time, she started spending more time with Emily. "Emily, has anything changed at school recently?" she asked casually, but Emily didn't seem ready to open up yet. Sarah continued to approach Emily patiently. They cooked together and played in the park. Little by little, she felt Emily's expression softening. One night, when Sarah returned from her night shift, she found an unfamiliar envelope on the living room table. It had Mark's name on it. Sarah hesitated, but, telling herself it was necessary to know the truth, she quietly checked the contents. Inside was cryptic information about a large money transaction. Sarah's heart began to race. Could this be related to what Emily had witnessed that night? Sarah took a photo of the evidence and put the envelope back in its original place. She felt a sense of getting closer to the truth, but also fear of stepping into unknown danger. As days passed, Sarah continued to carefully gather information. Mark's suspicious behavior, late-night phone calls, sudden outings. She recorded everything in a notebook and took photos of anything that felt off. Her relationship with Emily was also gradually improving. One night, as they were watching TV while eating ice cream, Emily began to speak in a small voice. "Mom, you know." Emily hesitated. "Do you remember that night?" Sarah's heart raced. "Which night, sweetie?" Emily looked around, making sure no one else was there, and continued in a small voice. "The night when Dad was talking to that strange man." Sarah gently hugged her daughter. "Emily, can you tell Mommy what you saw? Don't be scared. I'm on your side." Emily, with tears in her eyes, began to describe in detail what she had seen that night. The bag the unknown man had given to Mark, the coded conversation between them, and Mark's terrifying expression when he noticed Emily. "Dad was scary." Emily sobbed. Sarah held her daughter tightly and promised, "It's okay now. Mommy will definitely protect you." Hearing this story, all the dots connected in Sarah's mind. Mark's suspicious behavior, the large money transaction, and Emily's fear. Everything pointed to illegal drug trafficking. Sarah consulted with Ms. Thompson and sought advice on her next steps. "It seems you've gathered quite a bit of evidence," Ms. Thompson said with a serious expression. "But this is not something we can handle on our own. I think it's time to consult the police." Sarah took a deep breath. "I understand. But I'm worried about Emily. Emily's safety is the top priority. Let's also consult with the police about how to protect Emily." Sarah contacted the police and presented the evidence she had gathered. Understanding the gravity of the situation, the police immediately took action. While monitoring Mark's activities, decisive evidence was obtained. One night, the police caught Mark in the act of trading a large amount of drugs and cash. Sarah left Emily at her parents' house and waited for Mark to return home. The sound of the front door opening was heard, and Mark entered. Sarah, you're still up," Mark said, looking a bit surprised. "Yes, I was waiting for you," Sarah answered with a trembling voice. At that moment, the police burst into the house. "Mark Johnson, you're under arrest on suspicion of illegal drug trafficking." Mark looked at Sarah with a shocked expression. "Sarah, this is a misunderstanding. You have to believe me." However, Sarah's eyes were filled with determination. "It's too late, Mark. I know everything. About Emily, about your dealings." The color drained from Mark's face. "Emily saw." "Yes, she did. She's been scared all this time. Because of you." Sarah's voice was filled with anger. As the police handcuffed Mark and led him away, Sarah watched with mixed emotions. Relief, anger, and sadness. All were intermingled. That night, Sarah went to pick up Emily. "It's okay now, sweetie. We're safe." Emily clung to her mother. "Mom, what's going to happen to us now?" Sarah gently hugged her daughter and smiled. "We're in this together. And from now on, we're going to live honestly and happily. I promise." In the moonlight, mother and daughter took their first step towards a new life. Challenges may lie ahead, but they would overcome them together. That's what Sarah vowed in her heart. A year had passed since then. Sarah and Emily's life was slowly but steadily moving forward. In addition to her job as a nurse, Sarah had started volunteering at the local domestic violence support center. She found new fulfillment in supporting women in similar situations, using her own experiences. Emily had entered middle school and regained her former cheerfulness. She was actively participating in student council activities at school and her friendships were going well. One Saturday morning, Sarah and Emily were jogging in the park. As they took a break and sat on a bench, Emily suddenly started talking. "Mom, do you remember? This time last year, how scared we were." Sarah gently held her daughter's hand. "Yes, I remember well." Emily continued, "But you protected me, Mom. You're so strong." Sarah felt her eyes getting hot. "You're strong too, Emily. We overcame it together." Emily hugged her mother tightly. "Mom, thank you. I want to be a strong woman like you." At that moment, Sarah felt that everything had been worth it. The difficult days, sleepless nights, times when she felt crushed by anxiety. She felt that all of it had existed for this moment. "Emily, you're already strong enough. And you'll keep getting stronger." They smiled at each other and started jogging again. Later, Sarah headed to the support group meeting. Today was the day to welcome a new member. As she entered the venue, she saw a young woman with a frightened expression sitting in the corner. Sarah approached her and gently spoke. "Hello. I'm Sarah. It must have taken courage to come here, right?" The woman nodded slightly. "My name is Lisa. I need help." Sarah sat next to Lisa and quietly listened to her story. Lisa's story reminded her of herself a year ago. Fear, anxiety, despair. she could understand it all. Lisa, you're not alone. All of us here are on your side. Let's overcome this together. Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes. Thank you. I never thought I'd meet someone who understands so well. Sarah held Lisa's hand and smiled gently. I was like this at first too. But thanks to the support and courage I gained here, I was able to find a new life. That day will surely come for you too. After the meeting, Sarah returned home. Emily had gone to watch a movie with friends, so Sarah was alone in the house. Sitting on the sofa in the living room, looking out the window, Sarah reflected on the past year. It had been difficult days, but also days of growth. She had discovered strength sleeping within herself, built new bonds, and above all, deepened her relationship with Emily. Sarah took a sip of coffee and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, a new week would begin. Work, Emily's school events, support group activities. Busy days, but fulfilling. And Sarah made a vow in her heart to continue living strongly and kindly. For Emily's sake, and for her own. And for people like Lisa who need help. The sound of the front door opening was heard. Mom, I'm home. Emily's cheerful voice echoed throughout the house. Sarah stood up with a smile. Welcome back, sweetie. How was the movie? The laughter of mother and daughter filled the warm Sunday afternoon home. The outside world might still be harsh. But this house is filled with love and hope. Sarah felt that this was true happiness. The two of them, having overcome difficulties and grown stronger. Their new life had only just begun.